Hi, folks. I can see people are beginning to flood in, which is great to see. We're just going to wait for numbers to stabilize over the next 5 minutes or so before we start. So don't be unnerved that you're not seeing talk starting yet. We're just a wee bit early. So grab a cup of tea if you want to, or just hold fire and we'll start the session in 5 minutes or so. Hello, everyone. We're up to over 100 people now on the session, which is great to see. Numbers are still rising fast, so we're going to wait for numbers to stabilize and we'll start promptly at 7 o'clock. So just hold fire there and we'll be with you shortly. Hi, everyone. We're up to 158 people on the session so far, which is great. Numbers rising fast still. So hold on there. We'll just give it a few more minutes while numbers begin to stabilize before we start the session. Just about time, I think, to dash and make one last cup of tea or open your next bottle of wine or whatever it might be. And we'll start the session in a few minutes. Hi, everyone. We're a couple of minutes or so from launch. So just bear with us for a few more minutes. We'll just wait till numbers stabilize and then we'll get the session started just in a couple of minutes. Well, welcome everyone. We're at 7 o'clock, so we might as well start promptly. Very warm welcome from me to this second session of the BTO conference. If you were with us yesterday, you'll have also heard a fantastic talk about the work at NEP. If you missed that, then do catch up on that. You should be able to watch that again on our YouTube channel. We're sorry, of course, that this year we're not able to be at the Swanwick Conference Centre and seeing you in person. The pandemic, of course, means that we're needing to go virtual once again. But it is brilliant. We're able to engage with so many people via this format from all over the UK, regardless of whether or not they'd have been able to make it to the in-person conference. So there are upsides, and that's been true of our virtual training as well over the course of the last few years. Just so accessible now that anybody can connect over Zoom and join in. So if this is your first time, a very warm welcome. If you're an old hand at BTO conferences and events, equally a very warm welcome. My name's Ben Darville. I'm Head of Development and Engagement for BTO's country offices in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. We've got 3 fantastic talks lined up. I really hope you enjoy them. The way we're going to manage questions is at the end of each talk. So the webinar, Zoom webinar, has what's called a Q&A function. If you look at the bottom, you'll see there's a little thing you can click on and bring up a Q&A function. You can type your own questions in there. You can also look to see what other questions people have posed, and you'll be able to kind of upvote the ones that you think are particularly good. And when it comes to the questions, I'll kind of pick a few, probably won't have time to cover them all, but I'll pick a few, I'll relay those to the speakers. If you've got questions of a sort of more general nature about BTO, then best to hold on for the AGM at the weekend. We've got 11 amazing talks lined up for you over the course of this week, and all of this really is only possible as a consequence of your support. The support that we receive from members, from supporters, from volunteers is really critical to the way that BTO runs. In fact, over half of our charity's income is coming from your support. And we know that you support us in many different ways, many of you through your volunteering, through your involvement in demographic schemes and so on. And it's a difficult time to be asking this, but as you'll be aware, many charities, like many people, are struggling as a result of the pandemic. So if you are able to support us financially, we would really appreciate it. And it would allow us to continue with our priority work. So you'll see there on screen a link. If you make a wee note of that, bto.org/support. And then that's a way that you can support us if you've enjoyed the talks. Of course, another way that many people choose to support us is through membership. And if you are already a member, many thanks. Really, our members are our lifeblood. They let us do what we do. So huge thank you to you for your support. If you're not currently a member, please do bear that in mind. It's something you might opt to get involved with and support us that bit more deeply. And we welcome all of you very warmly. Right, I think we should start with our first talk. So we're going to be hearing from Ian Beggs, who's going to be talking to you about Skokums Wheatears. He's been working on this species there for a number of years now, following on from a long tradition of studying the species on the island. So I think we're in for a real treat, and I'm going to hand over now to Ian, who'll take the reins.
Right, hi, good evening, everybody. So I'm Ian Beggs, and I'm going to have a chat to you, and pun intended, about Wheatears on Skokum, which I have been studying since about 2017. So here we are. We'll start off with a wonderful male wheatear. All the photographs in the talk are taken by me actually out in the field, and I think just about all of them were this year. So they're not going to be fantastic portraits and the rest of it, but they are what I take primarily to read the ring number, as you can see on that bird there, A31. So there we have the male wheatear, and many of you will know this, an early migrant back here. Males tend to come first, and what a great sign of spring it is to see these guys bobbing up on the coast or on the breeding grounds, popping up on a rocky outcrop and that sort of stuff. Obviously they come in 2 flavours. The females are quite striking, but just as interesting, a variety of ways. A little bit more low profile, but there we have it. So there's Mr. and Mrs. Wheatear. So I've got about 20 minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to chat a little bit about the the Wheatears, a bit about previous studies and what's been done, particularly on Skocum in the past, because that's quite interesting as well, and the people involved. A little outline of my study and why I'm doing sort of what I'm doing in the way that I'm doing it. And a little bit, take 1 or 2 points to give you a bit more detail about some of the more interesting things that I'm sort of looking at now. It's all in progress. It's not at the point of being written up or anything, so it's really a snapshot in the study. And I hope you find bits of it interesting. I know there's a wide range of you guys out there from different sort of experiences. You might be ringers, interesting birds, might even be ornithologists, scientists. But we'll give it a go, and I hope there's something for just about everybody in there. So let's just have a little geographic pinpoint. We're on Skocum. We just have a lot of practice in how you say that, so yeah, do bear with us. And it's an island, and it's 1 mile long, half a mile wide, and about 2.5 miles off the southwest coast of Wales, off Pembrokeshire. Very famous, I think a lot of you will know, for seabirds. A lot of seabird study by Ronald Lockley when he went there in the 1930s, pioneering his work on Manx shearwaters, and established the first UK bird observatory there in the 1930s. And although it hasn't been a bird observatory all that time, it was reaccredited in 2014. There have been gaps as being a bird observatory. There's a huge recording data set which goes back 80 odd years, which is a fascinating thing to work with. So a little bit about this guy, Peter Conder. I know he's not a wheatear, but as you can see there, in the late 40s, early 50s, Peter Conder was one of the first wardens of Skocum. And he was a prisoner of war, and he learned a lot about ornithology in the war camps from other quite well-known, as it turned out, became very well-known ornithologists. And there's a little advert for a book. I have the book. It's obviously it's not a fun read in that sense because it's about prisoners of war, but very interesting to see how they developed their ornithology in that rather remarkable setting. Anyway, after the war, he came back and we warden of Skocum, and he wanted to study a particular bird. In those days, you made your name as an ornithologist by writing a monograph, studying one species in detail and publishing. Peter Conder decided, after chatting to his mates, that it was a good idea to study the wheatear. So wheatear study started in Skocum in 1948, and he was there for 6 years. He went back whilst he was working for the RSPB, and again after he retired, he went back again, and his findings are all published in the book The Wheatear, which is a fabulous read, particularly when you realise what he was doing with the equipment he had and when he was doing it, because there's a lot of stuff about Skocum work in there. So that's just a little side sort of angle. There have been other studies on Skocum. Warden Mike Brook did a study of how wheatears use their territories. That was in the 1980s. But I think that's probably the last published study that has been on wheatears on Skocum. Elsewhere, there was work done on Bardsey Island, which some of you may know, back in the early 90s by David Curry as a PhD thesis. And more recently, at the turn of the century, there's a couple of long-term studies in Holland and in Sweden on the wheatear. There's been other studies on wheatears, but that's the major sort of stuff which sort of helps me as I compare what I'm seeing with what was there. So let's just remind ourselves where wheatears live and go. The blue is their wintering grounds, so it's mainly the Sahel, south of the Sahara, really hot, and they all winter there, and they all breed in the orange areas. So you've got right across Western Europe, right to as far east as you can go, and then all the way wrap around the globe to Western Canada, Northwest Canada, Alaska, and places up there. And those birds are what are standard northern wheatears. The so-called Greenland type wheatears, which are a recognized subspecies, you get in Greenland and Northeast Canada, as you can see on the map. There's a gap in the middle of Canada where they don't have wheatears, but in Canada they have both flavors. So that's just give us a bit of a reminder there. What about, I'll throw some numbers in because I know people like numbers. But about 170,000 pairs of wheatears in the UK. I live in Wales, the studies in Wales, about 14,000 in Wales. And big numbers, I find big numbers really difficult to sort of comprehend on their own. But if you've got 170,000, that sounds like a lot. But there's 7.4 million pairs of robins in the UK and 5.1 million pairs of blackbirds. So that puts it into perspective. It's not a rare bird, but it's not actually that common. And there was a 72% decline in wheatear across Europe. And between 1995 and 2018, a 48% decline in wheatears in Wales particularly, most of which was in the last 4 years of that. So it's not although it's a bird that we don't see as being endangered, it's not unvulnerable, and it may well be heading that way.
Ian, I don't want to throw you off, but just to make you aware, your microphone is picking up the noise of you, I think, turning over your notes. So if you could perhaps manage to move them slightly further away from the mic, or just turn them over just a touch more delicately, hopefully we won't pick up on that background noise. And sorry to interrupt you. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so here's the wheatears. Again, fabulous little birds there. Chats. Related to robins, they sit up on the rocks, bob about, males, female, both territorial, and the males particularly territorial, especially early on in the breeding season. They're birds of the open country, short grass, rocky outcrops. One of the things they do, they're great mimics. They're great song mimics. They're not brilliant on songs, but if you find somebody who knows a lot about bird song, there's a wheatear about, they'll start telling you all the songs that they're mimicking. I had a great one a couple of years ago on the island, which actually mimicked a buzzard. So you're walking past this big rock, you heard a buzzard cry, you look up, and it's not. It's a little wheatear on the rock pretending to be a buzzard. Very interesting how they do that, because I'm pretty sure I've heard them do bird songs which don't occur on the island, so they must have picked them up from somewhere else. As I said, very territorial. The males come back first, and there's a good reason for that. I got some information from a mutual friend, because we were talking about why male wheatears come back first, why wheatears come back early. In fact, the males come back first to set up territory, but why are wheatears always so early? And it may be that we look at this from too much of a UK perspective. They're in the Sahara. It's really, really hot. They're birds of the open plain. Come January, it's too hot for them to sit out. They're not going to hide in a bush, because they don't do that. So they need to start moving north, and they may well be stopping over, but they need to get out of that heat. And of course, they come back here, and they can often spend quite a while before they actually start breeding. But it may be related to what they're leaving, rather than just looking at it from what they want to get back to here. They can have 2 broods. Further north, they only have 1 brood, but on Skookum they do have 2. Well, some do. About 60% of the pairs on Skookum have 2 broods, and there's the bird's got a choice to make there. Do they spend a lot of time investing in the first brood and making sure those birds have a really good chance of survival, or do they do a numbers game and kick the first brood off the patch quite early and then get a second brood? This year, there was far fewer birds had second broods, and that was probably because the weather turned nasty, and they all got a bit late. And I think a lot of birds probably thought, in the way that bird would think, I'm going to invest all my time in what I've got. I'm not going to go for a second brood. But again, that's a very interesting area to look at. They breed in crevices and burrows, crevices in walls, in rocks. On Skookum, they tend to breed in burrows more. There's a lot of burrows there. There's a lot of cliff nesting. There's a lot of burrow nesting birds there, Manx shearwaters, etc. And those and lots of rabbits, and those burrows collapse. The burrows collapse more to a wheatear size, and the wheatears can then move in. Very territorial. The males will see off any incoming male, and the females will see off incoming females. It's very rare for a female to see off an incoming male. There might be a little bit more to that than just defending the territory. There's a very good reason why the female doesn't want another female coming near her male. And I'll give you a bit more about that later. So my study,
I started off, it's as a colour ringing project. So it's registered with the BTO as a colour ringing project. It's also registered with the BTO as a retrapping adults for survival project. Because of course my data feeds right into that. Fabulous support from the island's owners, the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales. And we carried on. We started off looking at survival rates, wanted to try and see if we could find a way of seeing if there's an immigration to the population. We know there's juveniles can be seen on other islands or the mainland. So is there immigration? But as I started into the project, I thought, well, how am I going to present this? You know, I could just write a bit of waffle and whatever, but that didn't seem like a fair return for the work I was putting in and the support I was getting from the island's wardens and the Wildlife Trust. So I explored the idea of getting some university support. And so I ended up now doing a master's research project, which is nothing to do. I don't need a master's degree. I've had my career, but it will allow me to write this up in a way that is recognized in the community. So there's some value in going to be added to the fieldwork that I'm doing, and that it can be presented in, if you like, a proper way, which I wouldn't be able to do without the support of the University of South Wales. So as we started looking into it, there was other things that came about. We could look into the age structure of the population. Is that going to be a static thing? Are there always so many birds of the same age? Local networks. It's becoming really apparent that even on an island that's a mile wide, long and half a mile wide, that actually the birds only just have part of that island to themselves. They return to a discrete part of the island each year. So colloquially, they either come back to the same plot they had last year, or they have the one next door. And it looks that most birds do that, but the statistics over the next couple of years, when we analyse them, we'll be able to show that in a more defined way. Something down there, I got partner swapping. It's something that hadn't really been seen a lot in the past, but in 1 year, I noticed that 4 pairs actually swapped the partners between the 2 broods. Not sure why that hasn't been seen before. Not sure if indeed that behavior actually was there before, but it certainly was seen a couple of years ago. And in one particular example, which I did write a note to British Birds, if anybody would have read that, one particular male had his first brood with female A in a year, second brood with female B, and repeated the entire thing the next year. The first female came back for the first brood. The other female was elsewhere breeding on the island. Second brood time, she came over and mated again with the sitting male. So that's really interesting. That sort of the way the birds are tied to their territory, even to change it within the year. And of course, at the end of my study, I can look at any long-term trends and start comparing it to the sort of things that Peter Conder found. So this is methodology. That's me. This is my standard position in the field. Got a Wheatear in my hand. I'm just going through the standard ringing process. I use standard ringers spring traps where the bird enters the trap, pulls a mealworm, a live mealworm, triggers the trap, and just sits there in a little mesh tent until I take it out. And I always watch the traps because I'm fascinated how the birds behave around them. So that's standard stuff. I'll be measuring the wing, weighing the bird, and putting on this little green color ring, which allows me to identify the birds in the field. So that's what it sort of looks like. That's probably A31 again. Good friend of mine, comes close, I can get a photograph. It's also the oldest bird currently on the island. But it's not easy, and I have to take a lot of photographs to get one in focus, particularly if I have no idea what the bird should be or what territory I'm on. So first time in the year, I take lots of photographs, and that's what I use. People often ask me what I use. It's a Panasonic Lumix FZ82. It takes reasonable pictures. It's got a fantastic optical range of 60, and that doubles digitally. At the high end, you don't get a very good picture, but you get enough to read a color ring on a small bird. So early in the year, I'm taking hundreds of those photographs, maybe 50 or 60 a day at least, just to map those birds back. That's one of my early maps, which I've just hand drawn on a PowerPoint slide. 2019, you see where the pairs are. They tend to be around the coast. There's always one, usually always one around the central area where the farm buildings are, and the observatory. But most prefer the coast where they've got nice short grass at the top of the cliff, some cover inland where they can hide, and they can disappear over the cliff as a predator response. These maps are now being refined with my help from my university mentors into some very fancy geospatial mapping, which will allow me over time to be able to calculate through the software just how far any of those birds actually move during their lifetime. But that's for the future, once I've learned it properly. So, where are we going with what have I found? Well, I clearly got the survival data. I haven't got the figures here because I haven't calculated it all. But the published figures are about 50% for survival, slightly higher in males and females. My figures are at least that. So in that sense, the bird survival rate is very healthy compared with what data we've got. As I said before, we've got some very interesting stuff on site fidelity, with the birds returning to the same site year on year or nearby, not touring the island. And that also applies to the birds at the first back. You know, you have a bird that's first back, that the male could tour the island in the first couple of days if it was the only male there, but it still ends up where he was the year before. So I think this what is the best territory, you have to factor in what the bird knows as a factor, not just about the food supply, but what did it work last year? Am I comfortable here almost? Seems to be a big factor in the birds choosing the territory, not just the fact that it's a good territory. So that's one thing that's progressing. Behavior observations partner swapping I mentioned. The other one, which often amuses people when I put my tweets out, is scientifically extra pair paternity. So this is where the offspring in a clutch are actually fathered by a male, or some of them are fathered by a male, which is not the social partner of the female on the nest. Now, interesting figures. In Bardsey, in 1992 and 3, when David Curry did his work, he looked a bit at extra pair paternity, and he was doing genetics through blood sampling and that. And he found that there was 11% of the offspring in 29% of the nests were fathered by a male that was not the social male of the female on that territory. Interestingly, a more recent study in Germany found that 26% of the offspring in 46% of the broods were not fathered by the male on that territory. So that's really interesting and a very good tool for wheatears and other songbirds to spread their genes. I also had a look, I noticed some of my observations where I was seeing this really frantic males displaying to females, frantic and quick, no long courtship or anything, just flying in and really displaying. And I managed to identify some of the males. And in this particular picture, which you'll have to take my word for it, that male display on the right displaying to the female on the left is not the partner of that female. In fact, his territory is 500 meters away across 2 other wheatear territories. And he's come in and displayed frantically at that female. Now, at this point in time, the other male came and they had a big fight and display, and then he cleared off. And the next day or so, he was back on his own territory. Now, had the male not been there, he would have attempted to steal a copulation, but of course it's the female who would allow or not allow that. And I've got a few more examples of that where I've actually seen males way off their territory, frantically displaying against a female. Fascinating stuff. It hasn't really been recorded much in the past. And I think it's just because it's so difficult, because the male flies in, frantically displays and flies off. Well, how do you know that's not the sitting male? You wouldn't think that unless you could actually get the picture of the colouring. So that's really interesting, and there's a lot more to do on that. I think just the actual manifestation of what we know genetically is happening. Another interesting point is, if it hasn't been seen so much in the past, is it increasing? Is there something about today, climate change, etc., that's actually causing these birds to want to be more aggressive in that way, or is it just that we haven't seen it before? So where do I go next? Well, analyze and write up. So that's my winter at the top, and probably the rest of the winter at the bottom. I've got to apply some proper analytical techniques to this to really get value out of the field work I'm doing, and then write it up, as I said earlier, in a proper way. Where next? Just a couple of quick points about where I could be going next. We've got an application in with BTO Special Methods Committee. I'm working with a guy called Dr. Malcolm Burgess to actually consider putting data loggers on the Wheatears. That's a little backpack with a data logger on it, picture. And we do have to retrap the birds to take the device off so we can read it, read the data on it. And they're quite expensive, so there's a whole issue about funding there. But we do have an application in to do that. The committee have asked us some questions, and Malcolm is answering those. And the big thing for me on that is it would allow us to look at the route that birds take, and it would allow us to know where they're wintering. But we sort of have a clue about that. What would be really interesting is that these birds almost certainly are stopping over on migration for lengthy periods. And it's those sites that we need to understand more, because that's key in conservation. They might be fine at when the wintering grounds, might be fine where they breed. But if the stopover sites are the same sites, and they're threatened, then we will obviously need to try and do something about that. We put some nest boxes in across the island to mimic a burrow. And here's a wheatear that's used one this year. There's a wheatear nest. We took that out at the end of the season, once the birds had all fledged, gone and moved off. And that's what a wheatear nest looks like, and that's in a nest box. Fortunately, I'd had some help from Nick Davison, who's another researcher who goes to Stockholm, and he built me a nest box camera, and we trialed it. Unfortunately, we found a pair of wheatears nesting in a storm petrel box, so we had to have a quick rethink about that. But we got it, and I don't know if I can show this here, but here we have wheatears in a nest. And I've got about 40 hours of wheatears in the nest, which I'm going through to analyze at the moment. Here's some wheatears in the nest. I think there's three or four in this picture. Four. There's four birds here. It's very difficult to pick it out on the picture, but that's it. That is a wheatear in a nest box, and I've got several hours of video of them. And that's quite fascinating how they change over time, the sounds they make, the way they react to their parents. Anyway, I think that's about my lot. I've given you a quick run around wheatears, look at the studies that we've done on the island and elsewhere, a little bit about some of the things I'm finding, and a little bit about where I could go next should things work out. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you all, whoever you are, have been able to pick something interesting out of that. That's my contact details. Very happy to answer emails or get me on Twitter at FatSnipe. And for those who, if you don't know, no reason why you should, when I'm on the island, which is during April and then again June and into July, I always do a daily tweet about the wheatears. Try to make it a bit humorous, but there's always a serious scientific point behind it if you can look for it. So, okay, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ian, for a fascinating talk, and well done on that amazing study. It seems like some of your field work there is really enjoyable, I guess, as long as as long as the weather's good. And I love some of the analogies in relation to kind of moving in next door and getting up to no good with a neighbor and so on. I was with you on that anthropomorphizing right up until in response to danger, dive over the edge of the cliff, which I don't think humans would be very sensible to follow. So we've got some questions that have come in on the Q&A, and we've got time to pick up a few of those. One from Andy M, saying your map indicated 23 breeding pairs. Do you think that's kind of more or less the capacity for the island in terms of habitat and food and so on? Or is there anything you could do to increase the carrying capacity? And maybe at the same time, you could answer a question I noticed from Bob and Annie, who'd noticed that there was a gap between South Haven and Crab Bay. Why might that be?
Okay. The gap between South Haven and Crab Bay is, we've never seen wheatears there, really. This year, there was a pair just between Spy Rock and Crab Bay, but not in that. I think it's just too brackeny. I think Bob and Annie probably can picture this. If it's the same Bob and Annie, I think it is. But yeah, it's interesting. I do look there quite a lot, but there just is nothing in that particular area. Nothing in South Haven, nothing up on the banks. And the first time you come across wheatears, or I've come across them in the 5 years, is when you get to Spy Rock or maybe the Wreck Cove area in front of it. But yes, you're right. And there hasn't been any, and there aren't. I've got historical maps, and I'm not sure there's any on the historical maps either. The other question is actually 23 is a good average. 15 to 25 is sort of where the per numbers are most of the time. This year we had 30, which is about the highest number of pairs since about the 1960s. When Condell was doing his work, he had 40 something pairs. So it was much higher then. When Mike Brook did his work in the 80s, he was down to about 7. So it does fluctuate, but whenever it's gone down, it's gone up again. I think you probably have to compensate for when people are doing studies, because if you'd be walking around the island guessing wheatears this year, you probably wouldn't have come up with 30. But when Condell was doing it, you probably wouldn't have come up with 40 something, because when you're studying them and mapping them, you're going to find more pairs than if you're just doing, counting singing males or something in a standard survey. So there's a little bit to sort of adjust for in that. But yes, up and down. But the highest has been 40, 30 this year, 23 over the last few years is pretty good average.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ian. And a question here from Grant. So curious to know, are you able to find out anything about where the first year birds that have survived the winter return? Do they return to the natal site nearby, or perhaps a totally different site?
Yeah, great question. I think I should have probably answered that in the talk. Most of the colouring birds most are coming back to the island, but we have had 2 birds went to the nearby mainland one year. At least half a dozen have ended up in breeding pairs on Skoma, which is a mile away across the water. And we've also had a bird that we couldn't be identified, but it was a wheatear, breeding wheatear on Ramsey Island, which is a considerable way further north, which was seen in a breeding pair, but they couldn't read the ring. But nobody else is putting green rings on wheatears anyway. So that's interesting. So anything in terms of juvenile survival, which is probably about 25-ish to 30%, is very much a minimum, because we don't know where else they've been. And the only sightings we've had from the nearby coast, next island along, and an island right further north, whatever it is, 30 kilometers further north. But most seem to be coming back to the island.
Cool. I think we've just about got time for one more question. And this was, what made wheatears your sort of species of passion that made you decide that you wanted to study them?
I was going to Skokum, and I kept thinking, why is it always seabirds, and then of course the Condell's work was done on Skokum. But for me personally, there was 2 things really. I mean, this only really applies to me. In my youth, from a teenager onwards, in my early sort of 20s, I did a lot of mountain walking, and I still do, but the mountains seem much bigger these days. I used to go a lot of mountain walking in Wales as a youth, and I was also interested in birds. And it was like the birds you saw when you were starting to walk at mountains. There's always a little wheatear bobbing about, and it's always stuck with me as that striking bird. And also with the Peter Condell thing, when I was getting into birding, he was director of the RSPB, because you used to get your RSPB magazine out, and it'd be Director Peter Condell, and you think, wow, that's it. He must be important. He must know everything. So the name always stuck. So when I put the connection of the wheatears and Condell together, it all sort of came back, and I thought, well, I could do something here. I only hope I can.
Oh, thanks, and thanks for a fantastic talk. And I was interested, entertained, I'm not sure what the right word is, with the idea that these birds are leaving the Sahel because it's getting a bit too hot for them.
Yes,
there.
Yes.
And I wonder
that's not my idea. It was suggested by somebody else, quite an eminent person.
Sure. I just wonder how they then feel in sort of early March when they turn up on our shores and they're thinking, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something worth exploring, that, I think. Yeah.
We should move on anyway. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thanks. Cheers, everybody.
For a great talk. And sorry to those of you we weren't able to get through all of the questions there, but thank you for putting your questions in the Q&A there. So we're going to move on, and next up we've got Hugh Hanmer, who's a research ecologist with BTO, and many of you may know him or of him through his work coordinating aspects of Project OWL and the OWL surveys that we had running a couple of years ago. But Hugh's going to be talking to you about his research, his ongoing research on willow warblers, looking at Malt and trying to ascertain whether or not willow warblers in the south are molting too early. So over to you, Hugh.
Right, hello, hopefully that is shared. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about willow warblers, malt, climate change, and climate change. So first, I feel like I need to introduce willow warblers, and sadly they're not as common a sight as they, or sound as they used to be. So unfortunately, like many other long distance migrants, they are sadly declined nationally. They breed across the Northern Palearctic, so Europe and Asia, and they winter in Southern Africa. But on a UK level, they are declining. But if we look at the trend, in the Breeding Bird Survey, you can actually see the picture is a bit complicated. And the reason for that becomes a bit more obvious if you look at the trends for the countries within the UK. So we can actually see that in England, they're doing pretty badly. In particular, there was a particularly large drop in the early 2000s, some stabilization, and then a further period of decline, which may well be ongoing. Whereas in Scotland, they increased in the late 90s and have remained reasonably stable, possibly increasing since then. I'm not going to show you the picture of trends for Wales and Northern Ireland, but they are kind of in between these two, better in England, but worse in Scotland. But actually, it's not as simple as just looking at the countries of the UK. So if we actually look at the more regions, we can actually work out that in the kind of northwest of, well, Britain in this case, where the data research from BTO has been done over the past, northwest, they are increasing or stable. In the southeast, they are decreasing. And the reason for this appears to be due to declines in productivity. Now, the reason where this study comes in is that is this linked to a change in phonology? So phonology, if we don't know, is the study of the timing of biological events and processes and what affects them. So the classic example, which hopefully you've heard of in the context of climate change in particular, is that under climate change, we have warmer springs, and so birds are generally laying their eggs earlier. So this is the first egg date for willow warbler, and you can see quite clearly since the 1970s till nowish that they are laying their eggs earlier. It's an advance in the order of about a week, so it's not a huge amount, but it is an increase. Right, it is earlier. But phonology is about more than just the timing of breeding. So it's about the timing of the life cycle events and annual cycle events. So what does that mean? So in the context of an adult willow warbler, which is what this work is on, it's basically what is affecting their year. So they arrive in the spring from Africa into Britain, one of the breeding grounds. They reproduce, they lay eggs, they raise chicks, hopefully. They then molt following breeding. They then depart back from migration, and then they do whatever they're doing on their wintering grounds, which does also include another molt, which is unusual. But the thing is, all these events can be affected by the same things. So that means they could respond differently, and that means we could get what's called a differential shift. So they could be laying eggs earlier because of climate change, but they could also be molting earlier because of climate change. But the response could be slightly different, and that could have important consequences down the line. So before I tell you directly about the study, I feel I need to introduce Malt to the members of the audience who aren't bird viewers. So why is Malt important? Well, feathers don't grow constantly. They do need replacing. They get worn out, they get battered during breeding, during migration, so they get faded and bleached. Hopefully be able to make out the fact that the ends of these feathers are missing and a bit worn. And so they need to replace them with these nice new shiny feathers, which will then mean they can migrate safely to Africa. The issue is, though, that this molt is energy intensive. You can't really migrate while you're molting. you're less able to breed, so you tend to breed. Well, in the case of willow warblers, you breed, then you molt, then you migrate. But willow warblers are also quite interesting in terms of they have an unusual molt strategy. So they not only breed after they not only molt after breeding, they also molt in the winter as well, and so they place all their feathers twice in the same annual cycle. That's not normal. Most species only do it once. So a lot of our resident species and kind of shorter distant migrants, so things like blackbirds, blackcaps, robins, chiffchaff, etc., they molt pulling breeding, whereas most longer distant migrants molt in the winter, in our winter, in their wintering grounds in Africa. So things like reed warbler, garden warblers. Willow warblers do both, which is odd. But I feel what part of introducing molt is I need to tell you how you record it, because if we're interested in looking at the timing of molt, we need to work out when it starts and also how long it takes. Because if we catch a bird in molt, it probably won't be at the start of molt, it'll be somewhere in the middle. And so by scoring the feathers, we can actually get an idea of where it is in the process of molt. So we have scores going from 0 to 5. So O is for old, essentially. So these are the old, battered, worn feathers from the previous molt. 1 is a feather that's either missing or still in pin. 2 is the feathers come out, but it's under a third growing. 3 is a third to 2/3. 4 is 2/3 to 3, or to practically complete, and then 5 is new. Now, what does that actually look like in reality? So here's a pretend bird with a molt score. So most birds, they start molting their primaries first when it comes to their flight feathers. So these are the primary feathers. Most birds have 10, some have 9, but most have 10. And they start molting from the inside outwards. And then partway through their molt, they will start molting their other flight feathers. So these are the secondary feathers, which are not the subject of this talk, but you will see it shortly in some of the pictures. So we can score these based on the relative length using the previous scoring system. So this is probably about a third to 2/3 growing. So it's a 3. This is just through a pin, so it's a 1. So the entire, and these are all old feathers, so they have a score of 0. So this has a score of 4. So it's very early to molt. Now, if we look at some real birds, so these are 2 different willow warblers, one caught in April, one caught in June. These have all old feathers. They've not started molting. In fact, the bird in April hasn't even started breeding. So I hope you might be able to see that the bird in June is a bit more worn. It's in theory it's breeding, so it's got a bit battered in its feathers, but there's still plenty of life in them. And so it has old feathers and a score of 0. Now birds, they get progressively more worn, and then eventually they need to molt. So and during that period, they can look incredibly scruffy. So this bird is a nest of essentially old worn feathers and a few new feathers. So this is quite early on in the molt again. So this has a score of probably 3, 3, 2. I know because they have 10 primaries that there's a feather missing here, so it's a 1 or a 2. I'm going to call it a 1. And then all these rest of the feathers are old. Whereas we get partway through, you will see that progressively they get replaced. So this has a score of 25. It's about halfway through its molt. And the secondaries have also started molting as well. I don't have a picture of a shiny new adult willow warbler, sadly, but hopefully that gives you the idea that through this scoring process, we can track the progress of molts. Now, if we are interested in the timing of the phonology of egg laying and molt, we need to consider what we want to look at. So under climate change, we expect higher temperatures in general, slightly messier than that, but in general. And we know that experimentally from some previous studies that high temperatures tend to mean birds molt earlier. Molt earlier, and we know from observation, such as the graph I showed you earlier and various bits of the literature, that birds also tend to breed earlier as well into higher temperatures. We also potentially, if we want to look at a national scale, we've got to take into account things like latitude. And for that matter, we've got our difference in our population trends in the north and south-ish. So then we also need to consider what potential implications we might have there. So we know southern birds tend to breed earlier. Again, that's an effect of temperature to some extent, but also a photo period. So the stage in the year, essentially. And we also know that birds further north tend to molt, birds further south tend to molt earlier, and they may molt faster as well. Another thing we need to take into account, at least just for molt, is that males often molt earlier than females. To the point where sometimes the males will actually start molting while the female is still caring for the chicks or fledged young, and will not be less useful for raising those chicks. Now the question is, of this research, is breeding and molt timing responding to climate change in the same way or different ways? I.e., is there a differential shift between these two variables, or two demographic, these rates? And we can use spring temperature and latitude as a proxy for climate change. So if we look at what's happening in the south and the further north at different temperatures, we can to some extent measure what we might expect during climate change. So the data we used was Willow Warbler ringing data gathered by BTO volunteer ringers from 2000 to 2018. Only records with molt score codes and scores. So I'm afraid if you don't submit that information, your data wasn't included. Sorry. And we also used nest record data for the same period from the nest records scheme. And from that, we took records with competent estimated first egg dates. So that gives us the timing of breeding. And from the ringing data, we work out the timing of molt. We also, because we need climate data, we took Met Office spring climate data, but using a grid system that predicts the temperature for the spring at a 1 kilometer square level. And we calculate the spring temperature anomaly. So a temperature anomaly is where we compare for a period. So in this case, we get the average for a period of time. So in this case, 2000 to 2018. And we can compare whether the temperature for a given year is more or less than the average temperature for the period. So if you have a high temperature, a warm spring, it will be higher than average. So it'll have a positive number. And if you have a cool spring that's lower than average, you'll have a negative number. Now, if we want to model this, we want to model this because we have to calculate the stats on this very large data set. We're talking thousands of data points. And we're basically interested in whether latitude and spring temperature anomaly affect first egg date. We also want to know whether it affects the timing of and duration of molt. But molt is complicated. And part of that is because feathers differ in size. So the longest primaries in a willow warbler are these, which are longer than these, which are much longer than this little dinky one at the outside edge. So which is still a primary. So we have to allow for the fact that our score isn't, we can't directly use that. So you have to convert it to a proportional mass of the feathers. And then we use special model by authors Underhill and Zucchini, and that allows us to look at molt duration and molt start. Now, all that complicated setup, what does that actually mean? What did we find? So we can see that. So start fairly simple. This is going to look at first egg lay date first, with respect to spring temperature anomaly. So we can see if we take about the middle of the country, 54 degrees, so vaguely Harrogate, and we can see that with warmer than average spring, so if you're above 0, you have a warmer than average spring, molt is faster, and if you have a cool than average spring, molt is, oh, sorry, get myself mixed up, apologies. So they lay their eggs earlier. If you have a cool than average spring, they lay their eggs later. Now, if we consider across the country, So I've put some location names to give you a vague idea of where these actually correspond to in Britain. And you actually find, so you've got the same effect of warmer springs, earlier lay dates, later springs, cooler springs, later lay dates across the country. But you also find as you go further north, so 52 degrees all the way up to 56 degrees, that first egg date also tends to get later. Now, if you kind of ignore, now one of the issues with this is that the extreme temperatures and locations, we don't have that much data. So hence, some of this we're not that confident in, but the general trend is the same. These lines are all pretty much parallel. Now you'll see in a moment why I was getting my words slightly mixed up when it came to Malt Star and first egg dates. So if we take the same latitude as we started off with for the first egg dates, we can see that males tend to molt earlier than females. That's what we expected. And we've got the same effect of in warmer springs, birds they're molting earlier, in cooler springs, they're molting later. This dashed line is the constant model. So if all else between is equal, then latitude, temperature, sex wouldn't have an effect. We'd expect molt to start around the end of June. But if we look at other latitudes in this model, we get something a bit different to what we had for the egg dates. So we find in the far south, relatively far south, that birds are responding very strongly to warm springs. So they are molting much earlier compared to cool springs at the equivalent latitude. Whereas in a cold spring, regardless of where you are in the country, you're molting at about the same time. Whereas in a warm spring in the south, you're molting much earlier. So this is in the order of more than a week, plus 10 days. Whereas in the north, even in the warmest of springs, there's not actually much effect. So that means that we are actually getting a difference from the north to south, which we're not picking up in the first egg dates. So we put these together. So this is pretty much exactly the same data, apart from one point. So if we look at the first egg dates, we will see that we've got the same effect of getting later further north, but earlier with warmer temperatures. Now what we can do is we can calculate a rough fledging date. So this is when the egg is laid. We take the average number of eggs that a willow warbler lays. We'd lay one egg a day, and then we add the average amount of time it takes those eggs to hatch, and the average amount of time that it takes those eggs to, those chicks to then fledge. And from that, we can calculate a mean fledging date. And then that makes it slightly easier to look at in comparison to our molt information, so our timing of molt. And we can see that the angles on these are pretty similar. Whereas in the far north, we can actually see that this line is a lot flatter than this one. So there is a shift going on here, differential shift, one could say. Now, this isn't the only thing we found. So we do have, so I mentioned molt duration. We also looked at that. And if anything, the picture is even stronger. So in the north, basically, doesn't matter how warm or cold the spring is, you'll take about 40 days to molt. Whereas in the south, you can potentially molt. In a cold spring, you'll take 40 days. But in a warm spring, you can take as little as 30. So that's quite a big change. Although what it means, we don't know. So why is this important? So what are the implications and the mechanisms behind this? So we do have evidence for a differential phenological shift between the first egg date and the molt date with latitude and temperatures. And we expect more warm springs with climate change. Now, how does this link to population trends? Does it link to population trends? Now, willow warblers are generally single brooded. So if we've got an issue where you've got less time to breed, so you're having to molt, you're breeding earlier, but you're also having to molt earlier, then your window for breeding is likely to be shortened. So if you miss your opportunity the first time, you're not going to get a second chance to lay a replacement brood if you lose your eggs or your chicks. Alternatively, if you have to molt earlier, you might be a situation where perhaps well, the adults will continue to help provision the chicks even after they've fledged. So it may be if the male's having to molt earlier, but there's less able to then help with the chicks. We don't really know. This is work very much under underway, so the more may come out of this. And there are still a lot of questions. In particular, we've observed a change. So we've got shorter time to breed in the south compared to the north, and this is exacerbated by temperature. So is this is molt a direct cause of the change we're seeing? Because it happens to match up pretty well with the declines that we're seeing in willow warblers. So could it be a contributing factor? And if it is it a direct cause? So are they having to molt earlier? They have no choice in the matter. Or is it a symptom of some underlying cause? There are some possibilities, but we're currently trying to investigate what that would be. We don't know about molt duration. We have a very strong effect, and we don't know what it's doing. So we're starting to think about that. And the other question is, if this effect is important, can willow warblers adapt to it? So could we reach a point where in the north, you'll start seeing the same issues we're seeing in the south, and willow warblers will have less time to breed, and eventually they will disappear, perhaps? That is difficult to tell, but it is a possibility under climate change. It would appear, if this effect is important. So I have a note to ringers in the audience. So hopefully this study, even if it is incomplete, demonstrates the value of recording malt. Alongside an article that my co-author Philip put in the last spring issue of Life Cycle. So please, if you have time, well, always submit a malt code, but also where possible, submit a full primary score for any burst in primary malt or main malt. So because this is really valuable information, because I'm unable to use a significant proportion of the data that we hold on willow, we just didn't have the level of detail required. So please do submit more complete data if and when time allows. So in summary, we do have a differential shift in phonology, and that appears to match pretty well the regional trend divide. And that could have productivity implications. We're not sure, but it possibly makes sense, which would suggest that southern willow warblers are molting too early. There's still a lot of questions around this, and say the most important thing is whether the molt is directly important or it's something underlying that. There is a paper in preparation for this. Hope to finalize in the near future and submit. And well, thank you to my co-authors, Rob and Philippe, and to the BTO volunteer bird ringers and nest recorders for gathering the data in the first place. And for that matter, this work was technically originally funded by ringers in part as well. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh, and well done for being the second of tonight's speakers to stick to time. It's always great when your speakers time their talks so impeccably. So we have got time for a few questions. Before we launch into those, I'll just say from the point of view of my role here in BTO Scotland and on behalf of the country offices, how fascinating it was to see you showing the regional breakdown. And you highlighted there the importance of data, but ideally more data from some of the less populated parts of the UK to give us more confidence in understanding the patterns. And if you're on the session and you're one of the relatively few nest recorders who are active in Scotland or more remote parts of the UK, and you're going out and you're finding willow warbler nests, which in my experience are not particularly easy to find, but can be found, then thank you for what you do. Keep doing it. keep doing it, do more of it ideally, and encourage your friends, because you can see from Hugh's talk there just how valuable the data are when combined with the ringing data and Hugh's amazing analyses to really unpick what's going on. So keep it up. I'm going to start with the question from Jenny Gill, I assume the esteemed Jenny Gill, saying, might the shallower shift in molt timing further north indicate that a greater proportion of those nests are successful, i.e. they're starting to molt having successfully bred, whereas perhaps more of the southerly nests fail, so maybe they try again, for example?
It could. It's one of the possibilities we've looked at. So far, it doesn't appear that promising, but it is an avenue we're considering.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. One or two people saying, wow, those data look amazing. Could they see them again? I think the best way to do that is to watch again on the YouTube channel once the video is available to watch again. And the same would be true of contact details, Joanne. Kat asking if you could just recap over what time period the molt takes place. I know you did cover that, but just if you could just briefly recap, how long does the molt take?
So molt takes about 40 days officially, but yeah, 30 to 40 days. And the timing on average they will start in, well, say our mid latitude in Britain, and in an average spring we're talking about 25th of June, that sort of time.
Cool, thanks. A question here from Tony Powell. In your opinion, how important are ditch features or the presence of water sources for willow warblers?
I hate to say it, but we're looking at a national level, so we've not looked at that fine scale on this study, so I can't really comment. Okay,
no problem. And then we had a question. So some people will be aware, particularly those people who are tuned in, as well as broadcasting this over Zoom, we are broadcasting also over Facebook Live and YouTube, wonders of modern tech. So we've had a question from Kay Ounsworth on Facebook Live, wondering to what extent might the phenological data be skewed because of a lack of reporting, a lack of sightings. She's observing that, you know, within the UK population, only a handful of us humans will report sightings. Many birds will go unreported. So will that potentially affect our understanding of the phenological change?
Almost certainly. But we are drawing on relatively large data sets there, particularly the ringing data. We're talking potentially tens of thousands of records. So that's probably pretty representative. Say the nest records, particularly at the extremes, are a bit more uncertain. So yes, it could be that the change could be quite different, or it could even disappear if we have more data.
More data is always helpful, right? More volunteering, more data, but many, many, many thanks to everyone for getting involved. And thank you to you, Hugh, for your excellent, really interesting talk. So we're going to move on to our final talk of this evening, which is Sophie Pinder. Sophie works, I think, still for Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and was project officer for their Back from the Brink project. And has been working on willow tits, trying to understand why they've declined by 94%, with a particular focus on the Dearne Valley and understanding their habits and habitat. So I'll hand over to Sophie.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sophie, and like Ben said, I work for Yorkshire Wildlife Trust in more of a reserves management capacity now, but certainly before I was working on the Back from the Brink willow tit project, which ran from 2017 and finished in August 2021, so earlier this year. And I'm going to talk a little bit about willow tits generally, a bit about what we did on the project and future questions / research. So for those of you who might not be too familiar, this is a willow tit. They are a sedentary and endemic species to Britain. There are willow tits across Europe and Asia, but the subspecies that we have here is purely restricted to Britain. They're non-migratory, and they weren't actually discovered in Britain until 1897 due to their close comparison with the marsh tit. Unlike the marsh tit sounds like it should inhabit damp vegetated areas, but in fact marsh tits prefer dry woodland. Willow tits are the ones who like damp, scrub, wet woodland, former gravel pits, post-industrial sites, and they have this reliance on a very dense understory with plenty of standing deadwood, because they quite quirkily excavate their own nest in this standing deadwood. Feeding on invertebrates, in particular cranefly, spider and butterfly and moth caterpillars. So a bit of a varied diet. They will also create winter caches, so seeds and berries they'll cache for the winter when food is scarce. And they are incredibly rare and severely declining. So they are the second fastest declining bird species in the country. Only turtle dove surpass it. So 94% decline nationally since 1970. This map gives you a bit of a better idea. This is a BTO map from data from the 1968 to 72 atlas up until the 2007-2011 bird atlas. So the changes that you can see, the solid pink is where willow tits are generally considered stable. There's no great shift either way over that 50-year period. The dark grey, black areas are where willow tits have been lost. So a big chunk of the southeast of England there, East Anglia, and dotted around across mostly in the south. And you might be able to see, if you have really good eyesight, a couple of dark red points on there as well, which is where willow tits have increased, but it's quite rare that that's actually occurred. So you can see there's almost this kind of belt which stretches across from the south of Wales up through the Midlands, Lancashire, Yorkshire, and up into the northeast, where willow tits are generally stable. And this corresponds a lot with former coal mining industry. So a lot of Wales, as I've mentioned, Yorkshire, Lancashire, the Midlands, northeast, go back 50 years, were very strong in the coal industry. Since that's deteriorated, it seems to have created decent conditions for willow tit, which I'll touch on in a little bit more detail later on. So on top of a dramatic decline, the breeding range of willow tit has also halved since 1970. So it's contracting, squeezing into the middle of England, bits of Wales, and as I mentioned, lost from the southeast. And it's difficult to kind of pinpoint the reasons for decline, mainly because the birds are really quite scarce now, and they are quite difficult to study. But I'll touch on a couple of potential reasons. So habitat loss and fragmentation, as with a lot of other bird species in the UK, is an issue. Willow tits like this early to mid successional wooded habitat, which is often seen as low conservation value, or it's managed for something different, or it's cleared for development. And fragmentation, breaking up this habitat as well, impacts on willow tits, who really need a well-connected, joined-up landscape. Other issues are increased competition from other tit species, in particular blue tit and great tit will outcompete willow tit for nest sites, for food. There's been some research up in Lancashire in the Wigan area, which has been studied for a long time. The main cause of nest failure in willow tits was usurpation of nest sites from blue tit. So on a local scale, other tit species are posing a bit of a threat. Increased predation, so things such as great spotted woodpecker, which have seen a population increase of over 200–300% over the last 50 years. Potentially correlation to habitat change. So because willow-tit like this early successional scrub woodland, as that matures with lack of management or for whatever reason, that draws in woodpecker, it draws in other tit species, other competitors, predators, and leaves willow-tit more vulnerable. So things like climate change, habitat change are all impacting on willow-tit populations locally. And changes in climate and weather, specifically things like more dramatic winter spells in early spring. So a few years ago, we had the beast from the east in February, March time, which is just when willow-tits are really coming into their breeding condition, and it wiped out breeding for months, or birds perished in the weather. Delays breeding has a knock-on effect, coincides with lack of invertebrate food if the breeding season is delayed too long. So lots of little changes which build up and make it quite difficult. So looking at the Dearne Valley specifically, Dearne Valley was the project area for Back from the Brink, chosen because it was considered one of the strongholds of willow-tit when we first started. That gives you an indicator of how many willow-tits we've got now, slightly less than when we started. But in 2015, there were 70 breeding pairs in the Dearne Valley, which was about 200 square kilometres. If you look at this map, all the little red dots are territories, willow-tit territories. So you can see there's 3 kind of main hubs, if you like, Rabbit Ings and Carlton Marsh at the top there, which is an old, there's a disused railway site now, scrubbed up wetland reserve, Whisper Reservoir to the left, bottom left there. That is one of the best sites of willow carr wet woodland in South Yorkshire. That's always had a good population of willow-tits. And RSPB's Old Moor Wetland Reserve in the centre of the map there, which is wetland and scrub. But generally you can see this kind of trend that willow-tits use river corridors. So the solid blue lines are all major rivers. The dashed blue lines are disused canals, and the dashed grey lines are disused railways. And all of these linear habitats they support a good amount of willow-tit territories. And that's to do with the importance of connectivity across the landscape for willow-tits, which aren't a very mobile species. They really need continuous vegetation to move through the landscape. So highly farmed arable areas are generally where we've seen most losses. Potentially explains the southeast's local extinctions. So this gives you a bit of an idea as to what we started with on the project, 70 territories across the Dearne Valley. And one of the main parts of the project was this radio tracking protocol. So the BTO licenses were acquired by RSPB, who did the bulk of this work. Over 2 winter periods of 2017-2018 and 2019-2020, there were catching locations at hotspot sites based on the map that I've just shown you, where willow-tits were thought to be more frequent, and therefore we'd have a better success rate at catching them. So, caught with the usual misnets, we played a willow-tit recording to attract the birds to the area where we could catch them, fit them with colour rings, so they have a unique colour combination so we could identify individuals. The problem with willow-tits, though, is that because they very much like to stick to these dense, thorny bits of vegetation, it's really difficult to see them at all, let alone 2 tiny colour rings on their legs. So the radio tracking element was actually really, really useful in terms of looking at how these birds use the landscape, how they move, where they move. And basically what happened was tiny little radio transmitter was attached to the birds that were weighed, and only those that were heavy enough could have a transmitter attached. And those transmitters sent out a unique sound which could be picked up by a receiver. There's one of our lovely volunteers with the receiver there. And basically it enabled us to follow the birds around with a really high level of accuracy over the time where the transmitter stayed on the bird. So typically that was anywhere between 1 and 12, 10 or 12 days worth of data. And essentially it consisted of volunteers and staff following birds around, and every 10 minutes logging the GPS location of the willow tit with the transmitter. And that could be as accurate as a 10-figure grid reference, so fairly accurate. All the associated vegetation data was recorded, so where the willow tit was recorded as being, it would look at what the vegetation height was, what the species composition was, what the general kind of land use was, and all of that fed into a huge giant spreadsheet at the end of the project. And essentially at the end of tracking, what we ended up with was some really interesting maps. So this kind of demonstrates the winter home range of individual willow tits. So hopefully you can see this. I'm sorry if the colour combination isn't ideal. Hopefully you can see all the little stars. In this case, they are blue with an orange border, and that correlates to the colouring combination of this particular willow tit. So this was orange-blue, and he was a paired willow tit. We know because his mate was dancing around, she avoided capture and didn't have a transmitter, but we did see her occasionally with orange-blue. He was tracked for 5 days, and each star basically represents each of those 10-minute points that I was talking about. So you can see over the 5 days where orange-blue has been. This is an old disused canal, so this long strip through the middle of the map, this is an old canal. This is the old course of the River Dearne along here, so it's basically a low-lying floodplain. And following the closure of railways and canals in the 1980s, when the coal industry kind of fell, basically the management of the canals also fell through, and that allowed natural succession of scrub. So we get a lot of pioneer species like bramble, elder, birch, that sort of thing. And this is really, really good for willow tits. And you can see he spent a lot of his time in this kind of dense scrub here. Another interesting thing was that orange-blue fed in here, this little lump at the bottom, which is a conifer plantation, which is quite unusual for South Yorkshire, but in Scandinavian forests and in North Wales, willow tits are known to feed at the top of conifers, so perhaps not that unusual. But this guy covered 3.84 hectares, and that is their winter home range. So it's quite a big area for one breeding pair, but it turned out that that was actually quite normal. So this is another one. This is red-white, another paired, this is a paired female. The male also was fitted with a tracker, but he managed to pull his off within 10 minutes. So he got no data, but luckily red-white managed to keep hers on. A bit different in the sense that it's not a linear habitat structure. It's quite a blocky, clumpy, semi-natural plantation next to an old spoil heap. Again, very concentrated in this area where the vegetation was a bit younger, but she did go and forage occasionally into some of these other bits over here, which were a bit older in age and a bit less diverse in structure. But generally the activity was centered around here. And you can see on the left of the map a couple of points where she visited gardens, but only on really, really cold days when there was snow cover on the ground did the bird actually go into these gardens. And red white covered this whole area. Her home range measured 2.92 hectares. So again, we're kind of averaging around 3 hectares for a breeding pair's winter home range. Another example for you, this is another pair. One of them is blue, one of them is pale blue. These were both tracked together, and this is again another old railway line which was scrubbed up. Very, very concentrated, didn't really go anywhere else other than where they were comfortable. And that was quite a small home range, 2.14 hectares. But now we get a bit more interesting. This is baby blue red because he was a first year male willow tit. He was caught over here on the left hand side in this clump of wet woodland here. That's where he stayed on the first day. On the second day, he moved all the way over here to an old colliery site. And then on the third day, he bounced over here to another old colliery site, and then all the way down to the golf course. So very different to the other willow tits that were tracked. He's bouncing around all over the place. He's traveling a lot further, probably because he's unpaired. And he's not got his own territory. He's not got a mate. So he's traveling a bit more to find somewhere that he can call his own. But we look here to get from the first point to the second point. Disused railway here, disused railway here. This is that kind of importance of connectivity of post-industrial areas. The industry that used to serve the area is now closed down and actually creating really suitable conditions for willow tit. This is a slightly different map, but the principle is still the same. Another paired bird started up here in this area, but every single day traveled down to this site. So a completely different site. So 2 block patches of habitat this time. Traveled every single day to forage and feed. There were feeders set up at the sites at the bottom. So whether they were visiting that, I don't know. But the surrounding landscape here is very different. So it's a mixture of urban conurbation. There is some industrial scrapyards. There's roads. Apart from this tiny little strip here of, again, disused railway scrub habitat. And that's the only way that these birds were traveling to and from each site. So again, really emphasizing the connectivity of these urban places. So in summary, willow tits can occupy single or multiple patches of habitat, and they can be quite different. They can look very different. It's not just confined to small bits, to linear bits. It can vary quite a lot. And the non-paired birds in particular travelled a lot further than the birds that were paired. They're a bit more mobile, they're a bit more potentially desperate, or whether it's a normal thing to travel a bit further to try and find their own territory or the mate. But these home ranges generally over winter average 3 hectares, but like the one I've just shown you here, this breeding pair, their home range was 7 hectares, which is really quite large for a small bird, which is why breeding density is quite low in this species. They need quite a lot of suitable habitat just to sustain one breeding pair. The vegetation data basically showed that a mix was really important, a mix of heights, a mix of species, but generally it was consistent that a scrub layer of 1 to 4 meters in height is most suitable for willow tits. It's where they like to forage, it's where they like to hide from predators, it's where they like to nest. So woodland is not the best, but you can get suitable habitat within woodlands. It doesn't need to be on its own young scrub. But these connective corridors were really, really important in urban landscapes and are very likely to be just as important in more rural areas as well. Areas of farmland, hedgerows are really important. And increasing landscape connectivity is crucial. It will increase the species resilience, fighting the things like climate change and increased competition from other species. But still loads more research to do. It would be really interesting to see, to do some radio tracking at other times of year, in the summer with juveniles, that sort of thing, to get the bigger picture, because willow tits really are quite an understudied species, and we don't really know a lot about them, although this project has contributed quite a lot more. And that's a bit of info on the project, but that's me done. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sophie. And I was struck there by one of your closing points about the importance of scrub habitat. And it strikes me that maybe scrub needs a rebrand. You know, there's a lot of talk about the importance of woodland for birds and so on, but you know, your work there and my colleague John Calladine in Scotland as well, doing quite a lot of work showing just how important scrub is. But I don't know whether in the public eye, scrub is, you know, something that we should cherish or something that needs, you know, cleared out and replaced with something better. So yeah, more scrub, please. So lots of questions in the Q&A. So we've got time for a few of those, because yet again, you've kept to time. All three speakers have. It's absolutely brilliant. So Ken Smith asking, how long do these sort of ex-industrial habitats remain suitable for willow tits? And I'll ask a supplementary question to that, which is, you know, to what extent are they being actively managed to maintain their suitability versus just sort of remaining so?
Yeah, good question. Well, this kind of takes me on to towards the end of the project. So I said we started with 70 territories. We ended up at the end of the 4 years with 26. So that's quite a sharp decline in itself. And it's probably because actually we're coming to the end of that suitability, that niche. So really the 70s, the 80s was kind of the optimum time in South Yorkshire, and 40, 50 years on from that is when it's becoming much more unsuitable. And essentially these sites haven't had a lot of active management, and it's showing now with the decline. So there is definitely a balance to be had in terms of letting areas scrub up and letting natural succession do its thing. But obviously, without intervention, without management, these do become mature woodland, closed canopy, unsuitable. And that's the problems that we're kind of seeing in the Dearne Valley now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Question here from Frank Morby, which is close to my own heart. My PhD was related to this. Is there an issue with genetics and inbreeding and so on associated with small isolated populations?
I don't know conclusively. It's possible. There are issues with, obviously, with fragmentation in urban areas in particular, but also farmland areas. Willow tits are not very mobile, and obviously isolated populations, you know, will eventually die out if they can't disperse. It's quite likely. I watched a documentary years ago about tigers in Bhutan, I believe, and they were facing a similar problem. I don't know how comparable a willow tit is to a tiger, but it, you know, it's the same situation. Populations are becoming isolated. They can't move out. They can't disperse. They can't find new territories. So it's possible.
Thanks very much. And a question from Tony Powell here, because you talked a bit about competition with other tit species, and Tony's asking, have you observed or have others observed sort of direct competition, sort of squabbles and so on, or is it more a case of, you know, the willow tits, say, going to look for nest holes and finding them already occupied or that sort of thing?
It's a mix. So there have been reports sent to me of willow tits in the process of excavating nests and being abused by blue tits who are trying to take over. It's the same if a willow tit completes the excavation, they can be taken over then by blue tits. There is direct competition there, definitely, and I think there's a wider conversation around nest boxes in woodlands, which do attract the more dominant species of blue tits and great tits, and whether that is having an impact on species which require these niches, such as willow tits. And I know that there is a paper that's come out very recently about the impact of nest boxes and bird feeders. So I could possibly link you to that at some point.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? You mentioned that the willow tits were sometimes going to garden feeders in periods of cold weather, but, you know, is that a net benefit, or is the supplementation of you know, food for the commoner species which are there most days and therefore presumably have improved overwintering survival affecting the willow tits? That's probably a PhD in its own right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say to those folk who have asked questions that we haven't addressed that we are sadly out of time. So sincere apologies that we didn't have time to get on to all the questions there, but many thanks, Sophie, for a really interesting talk, and well done to you and colleagues for that important work. And thanks again to all of the speakers this evening for their contributions. I know everybody will agree that's been a fascinating series of talks. Just a wee reminder, if you can, please, if you've enjoyed the talks and you'd like to support our work, please do visit bto.org/support and give what you can to help support our work. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second of several sessions this week. So next on tomorrow, with me again as chair, you'll be sick of the sight of me by the end of the week. We've got a session on wondrous waders with my colleagues Sam Franks, Owen Williams and Richard Defoe, giving interesting talks on research into waders. That starts at 2 p.m. So do join us for that if you can. But that's us done for this evening. Hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful and hope to see you at some future BTO events. Cheers for now. Bye-bye for now.